This special presentation was produced in high definition by WEDU, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota.
Coming up next, President Obama made an historic trip to Cuba this week. He called for an end to the U.S. embargo and for Cuba to guarantee the rights of speech, press, religion, and voting. He met with Cuban dissidents. But back home, the visit was not universally praised, with Republican presidential candidates Donald Trump and Ted Cruz among the critics. A debate about U.S. policy toward Cuba next on Florida This Week.
From the WEDU studios, this is Florida This Week. And now, moderator Rob Lorai.
Welcome back to the special edition of Florida This Week. The U.S. and Cuba have had a tense relationship for more than 50 years. When President Obama visited there this week, he was the first American president to do so in 88 years. A lot has happened between the two neighbors in that time. Revolution in 1959, expropriation, executions, an embargo, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, attempted assassinations, the Cuban Missile Crisis, a boat lift, and now rapprochement, at least if President Obama has his way.
I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas. I want the Cuban people, especially the young people, to understand why I believe that you should look to the future with hope.
Diplomatic relations were restored 2 years ago, but the embargo remains. That means only a small amount of trade is permitted between the two countries. This week, the president addressed the Cuban people and called for democracy on the island.
I believe citizens should be free to speak their mind without fear, to organize and to criticize their government, and to protest peacefully. And that the rule of law should not include arbitrary detentions of people who exercise those rights.
President Obama was criticized by some for attending the Tampa Bay Rays baseball game the same day of the terror attacks in Brussels. And some in the U.S., such as presidential hopeful Ted Cruz, accused Obama of cozying up to dictators. Well, right now, we're going to have a debate about U.S. policy toward Cuba and the embargo. Taking the side of lifting the embargo are Al Fox. He's the founder of the Alliance for Responsible Cuban Policy Foundation and a former Democratic congressional candidate for Congress. And Barry Edwards is a political analyst and a Democratic consultant. Opposed to lifting the embargo, Colonel E.J. Otero, a retired U.S. Air Force officer, a political and intelligence consultant, and one-time Republican candidate for Congress. And Pedro Fuentes Cid is a lawyer and a former Cuban political prisoner. Well, welcome. Great to have you here. Thank you for coming. By the way, this debate will be timed, and our panelists can see a red light when their time is up. We flipped a coin, so we're going to start with Colonel Otero. Colonel Otero, why should we not lift the embargo and fully normalize relations?
Dealing with any country around the world, the United States, when we deal with another country in the world, it's a reward for behavior in the community of nations. When a country does that, or when a country agrees to change their ways in a certain way, recognizing human rights, opening the market economies and so on, we are more than likely, more than willing to start opening our ways with those countries that may have been opposite to us. The situation with Cuba is totally different because since 1959, the Castro regime has always rejected any kind of advances from the United States. And it's not just new with President Obama. It started with President Carter, continued with President Clinton, President Bush, and now President Obama. The difference is that President Obama is the first president that actually went over it and delivered it. But the response is always the same. The response from the Castro regime, it's almost a sense of pride to putting down the United States of we're not going to change, and the revolution is always going to win. And in this case, when Obama presented the goodwill of the American people by saying December 14th in 2014, we're going to start normalizing relations, at the beginning of January, Raul Castro said, we're not normalizing anything until you give us Guantanamo, humiliating the goodwill of the President of the United States one more time. So it happened with Clinton when Clinton decided that he was going to open a little bit the relationship with Cuba. In 1996, that happened, and then it was slammed again in in the beginning of 2000, in which Clinton tightened up again the embargo. The embargo, what it does, it's actually a situation. It is a legal document that tells the Cuban government, if you would like to deal with us, you need to do the following things. But it doesn't stop Cuba from negotiating with anybody around the world.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Al Fox, why is it time to lift the embargo and fully normalize relations?
The time is long overdue. When the embargo was put in place officially in 1960, it was put in place for two reasons and two reasons only. The first reason was that Cuba must break its military relationship with the Soviet Union. And two, Cuba must stop spreading revolution in the Western Hemisphere. Those two conditions were met a long, long time ago. And then what we have done is continue to move the goalpost. The embargo does not remain in place today because it has absolutely anything to do with socialism, political prisoners, or communism. The embargo remains in place today out of vengeance, hatred, and pride, and retribution. And any time you make any decision based on those factors, it is usually a big, big mistake. And I got to tell you, having just been in Cuba, and there when the President of the United States walked into that baseball stadium, and he received a thunderous ovation like you've never heard before. People were crying, people were hugging each other. It was one of the most emotional things that I have ever experienced in my life. And when you hear people like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio say that they stand with the people of Cuba, it was a big joke throughout the last week among cab drivers and doormen and waitresses when they would jokingly say, can you find the people that are standing with Ted Cruz because they're not in this country? And it was just a great time to be an American. Well, it's always a great time to be an American, but I felt great pride. You jumped in a cab, they had little American flags. You went to a restaurant, they had American flags posted there. And so I just think the time is long overdue. Put us behind us, and let's move forward. Cuba is a sovereign, independent country. And if people don't want to go there, that's their right. They should not go there, but they should not keep others from going there.
All right. Thank you. Pedro Fuentes said, why is now not the time to lift the embargo?
Well, whatever is left of the embargo, let's remember that when the embargo started, it was a very wide, things that could not be done with Cuba, which is not what it is today. Today is the little embargo that's left. Like the Colonel said, Cuba can do commerce with all countries in the world, and the only reason why it's not doing more commerce with the United States, from which they were buying medicines and food and everything else, is because they don't have the money and they want credits. So it's a very well-known thing that Cuba does not pay what they owe. Most of the people that have lent Cuba money have lost that money. So that's one of the things. And what Al was saying specifically about the reasons that made the embargo be there in the first place, I think he missed some things, like, for example, respect for human rights. That's what a lot of people here in the United States are asking the Cuban regime, to respect human rights in Cuba. I mean, our brothers and sisters there are subjected to gross violations of human rights. The ladies in white in their Sunday marches, which are peaceful, and are asking for freedom for Cuban political prisoners, are beaten up, are put in prison, and are treated like animals. Some other people that are marching together with them are just subjected to the same mistreatment.
All right, thank you. Barry Edwards, why is now the time to lift the embargo and normalize relations completely?
It's past time. In 1973, Richard Nixon went to China. In 20 years, people are going to say Obama went to Cuba. and it's going to be a momentous occasion. When Nixon went to China, we had zero trade with China. Now, this last year, 15% of our trade, $600 billion, was with China. And with that, it's given us leverage over human rights. China was probably the most repressive regime in the world at that point. Today, it's still repressive. And what's interesting, Freedom House and the UNESCO and some other organizations that do ratings rate China and Cuba today at roughly the same human rights violations. So I wondered, it's curious to me how we can do 15% of our trade with one country and it's not objectionable, but with Cuba, which is a tiny country, we can't. Senator John McCain went to Vietnam in 1985. This is after he was a prisoner of war and tortured. Time moves on, and either we can be anachronistic and get stuck in time, or we can move forward. But addressing some of the human rights violations. Last year, according to the UN, China had 3 executions per 1 million people. Saudi Arabia has 1 execution per 1 million people. Cuba has not had an execution since 2003 when they executed someone who tried to hijack a ferry. So there are human rights violations, and it certainly was worse after the revolution. As Fidel Castro said, revolutions are not a bed of roses, but also ending a revolution is not a bed of roses. And as far as not being paid, when we were there 2 years ago, Vladimir Putin forgave $27 billion of the debt to the Soviet Union, which has now been transferred to Russia. But the important thing is, we talked to people that were setting up Spanish hotels and hotels from other Europeans, and they are getting paid. And 20 years ago, I don't know what happened then, but as a capitalist, if I sell 1,000 pounds of oranges from St. Petersburg and I sell them to a Cuban and I don't get paid, I'm not going to send them another 1,000 pounds of oranges. So let the capitalistic market function.
All right, Barry, thanks a lot. Al, next round, we're going to start with you. And I want to pick up on something that EJ and Pedro said. And that is that Cuba's given us nothing in the sense that they haven't moved towards democracy and openness and human rights, and that both President Clinton and President Carter made some moves to open the relationship between the two countries. Has Cuba not moved, and are you rewarding them for not moving? Let's start there. And we have a minute for this round for everybody.
Well, I think your premise is wrong to say that they've not done anything and rewarding them for nothing. We took Cuba off the list of terrorist nations, and we got nothing for it. But Cuba never should have been on that list in the first place, because they've never committed an act of terrorism against anyone. On the human rights violation front, yes, there are human rights violations in Cuba by our standards, but we hold Cuba to a different standard. We don't hold Saudi Arabia to that standard. We don't hold China to that standard. We don't hold Vietnam to that standard. We don't hold Yemen to that standard. We don't hold the Sudan to that standard. Why do we hold Cuba to a standard that's impossible to meet?
All right. Pedro, let's start with that, too, and take a minute to describe. You know, we do have a very close relationship with China. We do a lot of trade. We have a close relationship with Saudi Arabia. By some measures, they have a worse human rights record, according to Barry and to Al. What would you say about that? I mean, you know, of all the countries that the U.S. maintains an embargo on, is Cuba the right one?
Well, I think Cuba has a much worse history of violating human rights and executing political prisoners than any other country in the world. We're talking about a country with, when the revolution started, 6 million inhabitants. And there were approximately 10,000 people that were executed during a number of years until the last months of Fidel, when he executed 3 persons for trying to steal a vote. And also 1 million ex-political prisoners. 1 million out of 6 million people. So I think that, you know, is a very powerful reason to take into consideration when we are trying to decide if we do something or not that is positive for those people.
All right, Barry, let's pick up on that. The human rights record of Fidel Castro's government, going back to the revolution in 1959, as Pedro said, he says that there's 1 million political prisoners and many executions. What would you say about that?
There were executions. I think we ought to put it in context why the revolution started. Most of the organizations that I could find, and we didn't have the ratings like we do with the UN today, but Batista, the president back in the 50s and before that, was ranked by most people as one of the top 5 most brutal dictators in the world. And in fact, from 53 to 58, he executed 20,000 Cubans, which has been verified. I have a population at the beginning of that of 4 million. So he was very brutal. And he would regularly seize property, which has also been verified by third-party groups, and distribute it to his friends and cronies. So that was what sparked the revolution. And when Fidel started the revolution, there were executions, but there hasn't been since 1993. And the political prisoners, I talked to dissidents when I was down there this week. They usually get detained for a day or two and then get let out. Very similar to if I'm protesting the president coming and I'm throwing things, we clean up the streets. Is it good? I don't think so, but it is what it is. But it's certainly not rising to the levels of North Korea or Saudi Arabia.
All right. EJ, how would you respond to what Barry just said?
It's ridiculous. To compare a freedom of speech society like ours, when somebody gets arrested for doing something that is outside of the law and taken to downtown and usually released within an hour or two, here in the United States, with taking somebody beaten and thrown in jail in Cuba because they simply complained in front of the ESPN reporter. I mean, that is questionable to where the judgment on that one comes from. I will also say, if I may, about something that Al said, that Cuba has not been has not supported terrorism anywhere in the world. They still do. Hezbollah has an office in Havana. The ETA from the Basque movement in northern Spain, they have had support in Havana. The FARC had support for a very long time coming directly from Havana. When I was in Colombia, there were Cuban elements training FARC guerrillas, which is one of the worst terrorist groups in the world. So, I mean, to say that Cuba have not had a role with terrorists around the world, it's incorrect.
Okay, we may want to pick up on that in a second, but Pedro, it's your turn for this next minute round. You said that the embargo was quite small and has had little effect. Yet we hear from people like the Cuban government who say that it has had a great effect on the economy. Why do you say the embargo has had little effect on Cuba?
Well, what I'm saying is that the embargo, Cuba can buy whatever they want from anybody else. We are just one nation that is not doing full commerce with Cuba. That was not doing it. Because right now, Cuba can buy anything from us. So that's why I say that what's left of the embargo is almost nothing. And before I finish, I wanted to talk about something that Barry mentioned that I think needs correction. The dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista it cannot be compared to the dictatorship of the Castros. It is like comparing a little thing like this to a mountain. I mean, the dictatorship of Batista gave Castro a sentence of a few years, liberated him in like 2 or 3 years, and they gave me a 60-year sentence for something that was much, much smaller than what Castro did, and he was just let go.
You served 16 years in a Cuban prison.
I served 16 years in Cuba's prison.
Barry, what about that? The 2 points that he's saying that your information about the Batista, the terror under the Batista regime is wrong, and he's saying that the embargo it hasn't had that much impact on Cuba.
Well, everybody's entitled to their own set of opinions, as Pat Moynihan used to say, but you're not entitled to your own set of facts. There were 20,000 verified executions in a 5-year period in the 50s by the Batista government. That's more executions than happened the entire time under Fidel Castro. Well, okay, we can debate that in the green room afterwards. But as far as the embargo having an effect, the embargo's had a dramatic effect. If I'm shipping refrigerators from Liverpool, England, to Cuba on a ship, when it goes into the Cuban port, it cannot come to the United States for 6 months. So it's not a matter of just go back and double the shipping cost. Normally that ship would make 4 or 5 stops on the way. So it's quadrupling or quintupling the shipping cost. So that's number one. The technology of 10% of American technology, eliminating almost all technological innovations that we have, or whether it be our auto engines or appliances. And also banking. If you did banking with the United States, you couldn't apply credit as far as credit lines to Cuba. So how could they pay when they couldn't use international banking? So we're criticizing them for something that we're imposing the inability of them to do. And as I said, if you look at the new hotels and stuff down there, they've been paying the last few years. You know, they had a bad period in the 90s.
Okay.
But if you,
all right. EJ, follow up on those thoughts that Barry just said.
They have not paid since 1959 alone, not one loan. To the Russians, to the Paris group, to China, they owe $311 million. To the Paris group, they owe $32 billion. To the Russian government, they owed $32 billion. They have never paid that. They have defaulted on every loan that they have had. It is bad business to deal with a government like that. Now, I'm not saying that the embargo would resolve that issue. Whether you lift it or not, it's not going to resolve that, because it is a decision of the government of Cuba how they handle their finances. And they haven't handled them well at all. They have been living on a handout since 1959, first with the Soviet Union, then with China, now Venezuela, and trying to get back into the good graces of Russia, and certainly trying to approach us for us to give them the handout, which is going to be a loss for the American citizens. The American citizenship is going to lose their money going into Cuba, and the taxpayers here are going to end up paying for that disaster that we have in Cuba.
All right. Al, how would you wrap this up, this round?
I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, you can say that up is down and down is up and black is white and white is black. For example, there's not a scintilla of evidence that Cuba is housing terrorists in Cuba. And if they are, then shame on our government that we're not over there and taking them out. Okay, so that's just an insane statement to make. And as far as Cuba pays or don't pay, or things were better under Batista or under Fidel Castro, frankly, I don't care. The only thing I care about is America. What is in America's best interest? And the Batista dictatorship had a friendly relationship with the United States because they posed no threat to us. And the Cuban government today and the Cuban people today want nothing more than to be friends with us. And that's okay with me, and so well it should be.
All right. Well, we've come to the point of closing statements, and everybody's going to get a minute to close here. EJ, let's start with you. How would you sum up this debate so far?
It is interesting. It's not enough time, obviously, because there's political reasons that we can get into it, as well as military and a number of other things. But one thing I will say that Al mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, he said that the two reasons for the beginning of the embargo was breaking away from the Soviet Union and denying involvement in revolutions around the world. And they stopped doing that a long time ago. Well, up until the early 1990s, they were still doing it. And in the year 2000, they were still getting involved with the FARC, getting involved with the Chavez regime, et cetera, oppressing the people. So they never gave that up. Had they done that, and the new requirements for the drop of the embargo had been met, any president would have gone ahead and reached out to Cuba and says, all right, you're already acknowledging human rights like Vietnam did and like China did. They came to the table willing to accept that. Cuba denied it. Cuba declined it every single time. They said, we don't need you, the United States. Keep your embargo. We're never going to negotiate.
All right, EJ, thanks a lot. Al, you have a minute. How would you sum up some of the loose ends of this debate?
Well, you can see that this is the tragedy, you know, that we're just going around a circle and people are making wild statements that cannot be verified. And that's not what this issue is about. I mean, the issue is very simple. Is Cuba a threat to the security of the United States? Cuba is a sovereign country. For the last 18 years, the United Nations, 188 countries in the world vote to denounce the United States, the greatest country, the greatest democracy in the world, and the United Nations votes year after year after year denouncing the United States embargo towards Cuba. What else does anyone need to know?
All right. Pedro, your turn. Sum up.
Sure. Okay, it was very interesting to point out something. The Castros have governed Cuba for 57 years through terror, instilling terror on the population, and I repeat, keeping 1 million Cubans as political prisoners for certain periods of time, which compared to the Batista regime, and I come back to that because I fought the Batista regime, is like comparing a kitten to a lion. Let me tell you something. The people that fought the Batista regime alongside with Fidel and Raul Castro, I was one of them, almost all of them were shot by the firing squads when they denounced that Cuba had turned communist and that the revolution had not complied with its commitment to hold elections in 2 years. So that made them start shooting people to just stay in power.
All right, thank you. Barry, how would you sum this up?
In 2014, when I visited Cuba with Al Fox, when we were there, when we arrived, Putin was leaving. When we left, the Chinese were coming. And it wasn't good to have Cuba and Russia in a strong relationship with us in 1960, nor would it be today, nor would it be for China. And it's in our own self-interest. Environmentally, if we didn't have the embargo, we could be running the oil wells, that if there's a spill in the deep water around Cuba, is going to devastate the Florida Keys and our east or west coast. If there's a terrorism attack, because they don't have a strong military to patrol their country, they could launch rockets from Cuba, taking down airliners over Miami. And also for drug interdiction, which is not a problem in Cuba. But I'll close with, this is, when we were there at the ball game, the brotherhood that was formed at that game with people taking off jerseys and giving each other caps was an emotional experience that I'll never forget. And this is the holiest of Christian holidays on Sunday, Easter. This is a time of redemption and reconciliation, and I hope that we can do that.
All right. Well, thank you all for a good debate, and thank you for watching Florida This Week. There's more. We're going to continue the conversation online. Please go to WEDU.org to see more of this debate. Thank you for watching Florida This Week. We want to hear from you. Please write us at ftw@wedu.org or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 and Sunday afternoon at 12:30. And from all of us here at WEDU, have a great weekend and happy Easter.
Florida This Week is a production of WEDU, who is solely responsible for its content.